From a series of cheap laptops in coffee shops and public libraries, a young man in his 20s built something the world had never seen. A hidden marketplace where, for almost 3 years, more than 100,000 people bought and sold illegal drugs with a few clicks, paid in a currency most of the planet had never heard of, protected by encryption that even governments struggled to break. He called himself the Dread Pirate Roberts. To his followers, he was a revolutionary building a world beyond the reach of any government. To prosecutors, he was a drug kingpin who had simply moved his empire onto the internet. He was careful. He was patient. He was, for a while, almost untouchable. And he was brought down, in the end, not by some master hacker, but by an old forum post he had written years before, sitting quietly on the open internet, waiting to be found. This is the complete story of Silk Road. Before the alias, before the empire, there was just Ross Ulbricht, a bright, well-liked young man from Texas with degrees in physics and material science. The people who knew him described someone thoughtful and idealistic, more interested in philosophy than crime. And it was philosophy, more than money, that lit the fuse. Ulbricht had become deeply influenced by libertarian ideas, the belief that people should be free to make their own choices, including bad ones, without a government telling them what they could buy, sell, or put into their own bodies. He dreamed of building a truly free market, a place where transactions happened purely by consent, outside the reach of the state. Most people with that idea write a blog post about it. Ulbricht decided to build it. And to build it, he would need 2 technologies that had only recently come of age. The first was Tor, short for the onion router. Tor is software that hides where your internet traffic is coming from, bouncing it through layers of relays around the world until the trail is almost impossible to follow. It powers what people loosely call the dark web, a part of the internet you can't reach with an ordinary browser or find on Google. By hosting his site on Tor, Ulbricht could hide its location and his own. The second key was Bitcoin. In 2011, the cryptocurrency was still a curiosity, but it had one property a man in his position needed: you could move money over the internet without a bank, without a name attached, just a string of characters. Every payment was recorded on a public ledger, but as long as you never linked your real identity to your wallet, you could spend with remarkable anonymity. Tor to hide the site, Bitcoin to move the money. Put them together, and you had the recipe for something genuinely new, a store the authorities couldn't see, selling things they had spent decades trying to stop. Silk Road launched in early 2011. According to the case against him, Ulbricht didn't just build the platform. To give his new marketplace something to sell, he reportedly grew a batch of psilocybin mushrooms himself, the site's first product. Then he started quietly seeding mentions of it online. For a few months, it was a small experiment. Then, in June 2011, a popular website published an article about this strange new place where you could buy almost any drug imaginable, and traffic exploded. What made Silk Road work wasn't just secrecy, it was trust. Ulbricht built it to feel like a normal shopping site: product listings with photos, seller pages, star ratings, and customer reviews. He added an escrow system that held a buyer's Bitcoin until the product actually arrived, protecting people from being ripped off in a marketplace where no one could call the police. In other words, he solved the hardest problem in any black market: the problem of trust between criminals, using nothing but good software design. The numbers became staggering. Over roughly 2.5 years, investigators say the site handled well over 1 million transactions, connecting thousands of sellers to more than 100,000 buyers worldwide, with the operator earning tens of millions of dollars in commissions. It was, in effect, the Amazon of the underworld. As the site grew, so did its leader's legend. Ulbricht took the name The Dread Pirate Roberts, borrowed from the film The Princess Bride, where the title isn't a person but a role, secretly handed from one captain to the next. It was a perfect mask. It suggested the operator wasn't a single, vulnerable human being, but an idea that could never really be killed. On the site's forums, the Dread Pirate Roberts became something between a CEO and a prophet. He wrote long posts about freedom, economics, and the philosophy behind the marketplace. He talked about Silk Road, not as a drug bazaar, but as a movement, proof that people could build their own systems outside the control of the powerful. Thousands of users hung on his words. To them, buying drugs on Silk Road wasn't just shopping, it was an act of rebellion. But beneath the philosophy, the operation had a much darker side, and as the money grew, so did what its leader was allegedly willing to do to protect it. For all the talk of freedom and consent, the products moving through Silk Road were real, and so was the harm. Prosecutors later linked drugs purchased on the site to at least 6 overdose deaths around the world, including young people, some still teenagers, who took substances ordered through the marketplace. And then there is the most disturbing chapter of the case, one that has to be described carefully and precisely. Prosecutors alleged that the dread pirate Roberts, fearing that certain people could expose the operation, commissioned murder for hire, paying out hundreds of thousands of dollars to have them killed. Here is what is firmly established and what is not. Investigators say none of these alleged killings were ever actually carried out, there were no bodies, and at least one was apparently an elaborate scam played on the dread pirate Roberts himself. Ulbricht was never charged with murder for hire at his main trial in New York, though prosecutors were permitted to introduce evidence about the allegations. A separate indictment built around a murder for hire accusation, filed in Maryland, was later dismissed in 2018, permanently. So these allegations hang over the case, raised by the government, disputed by his supporters, and never tested by a murder conviction. They would, however, shape how the world saw the man behind the mask. By 2013, Silk Road had become a top priority for U.S. law enforcement, with agents from multiple agencies hunting the figure behind the alias. The problem was the technology itself. Tor hid the servers, Bitcoin hid the money, and the dread pirate Roberts was disciplined. For a long time, they had nothing. The breakthrough didn't come from cracking the encryption, it came from a search engine. An investigator with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division named Gary Alford was working the case, and he had a simple, almost old-fashioned hunch. A brand new, hidden website, he reasoned, couldn't appear out of nowhere. Somebody would have had to advertise it on the ordinary, public internet to attract its very first users. So he started searching for the earliest mentions of Silk Road online. And he found one. On a forum, in early 2011, just as the site was getting started, a user with the handle Altoid had posted about this interesting new marketplace. The same username appeared again months later, in a post asking for programming help, with one crucial difference. This time, the user had left a contact email address. That address contained a real, full name, Ross Ulbricht. Years of careful anonymity, undone by a message left in the open, the digital equivalent of a bank robber signing the guest book on his way in.
But Silk Road's story has a twist that is often forgotten, one that complicates the simple tale of good guys catching a bad guy. While agents were closing in on the dread pirate Roberts, 2 of the federal investigators assigned to the case were secretly robbing it. A DEA special agent named Carl Force and a Secret Service agent named Sean Bridges, both working the Silk Road investigation, used their inside access to enrich themselves. They created secret online identities, extracted information, and moved cryptocurrency into their own pockets. One of them admitted to stealing well over $800,000 in Bitcoin during the investigation. In the end, the hunters became defendants. Carl Force was sentenced to about 6.5 years in prison, Sean Bridges to nearly 6. It is one of the strangest features of the entire saga, a case about a man who built an empire on the idea that the system was corrupt, in which some of the very agents sent to bring him down turned out to be corrupt themselves. By the autumn of 2013, investigators had a name, a face, and a city. But knowing who the dread pirate Roberts wasn't enough. To make the case ironclad, they needed to catch him in the act, logged into Silk Road as its administrator, before he could slam his laptop shut and encrypt everything inside. On October 1, 2013, they found their moment. Ulbricht was working, as he often did, in a public library, the Glen Park branch in San Francisco, his laptop open and connected to the site he secretly ran. Agents moved into position. According to the government's account, to make sure the laptop stayed open and unlocked, they staged a distraction. Nearby, what looked like a noisy couple's argument suddenly broke out, pulling his attention away for a critical second. In that instant, agents seized the open computer before he could touch it. On the screen, investigators said, was the administrator's control panel of Silk Road, the private back end of the entire empire,
logged in as the Dread Pirate Roberts. The mask and the man were, at last, the same person, caught in the same frame. The trial began in Manhattan in January 2015. Over about 3 weeks, prosecutors laid out a mountain of digital evidence, much of it pulled from that seized laptop: chat logs, a journal, spreadsheets, the inner workings of the marketplace. The jury took only a few hours to return its verdict. Guilty on all 7 counts, including running a continuing criminal enterprise, drug trafficking, computer hacking conspiracy, and money laundering. Then came the sentence, and it shocked even people who believed he was guilty. In May 2015, the judge sentenced Ross Ulbricht to 2 life terms plus 40 years, with no possibility of parole, and ordered him to forfeit more than $180 million. At the sentencing, the parents of young people who had died after taking drugs bought on Silk Road spoke about their loss. The judge framed the punishment as a deterrent, a message to anyone who might try to build the next Silk Road. To his supporters, the sentence was monstrous, wildly out of proportion for a nonviolent first offender who had never been convicted of hurting anyone directly. 2 life sentences, for building a website. That tension, between the harm the site enabled and the severity of the punishment, would keep the case alive for the next decade. Behind bars, Ross Ulbricht became a symbol. A movement formed around him, Free Ross, led in large part by his mother and embraced by libertarians and the cryptocurrency community, who saw in his case everything they distrusted about government power. A man, they argued, sentenced to die in prison for transactions that other people had carried out, for building a tool rather than pulling a trigger. For years, it was a cause that simmered at the edges of politics. Then it reached the center. In the run-up to the 2024 election, libertarian leaders pressed the case directly to Donald Trump, arguing that freeing Ross Ulbricht could win over their movement. He made it a campaign promise. And on January 21, 2025, he kept it, granting Ulbricht a full and unconditional pardon. After more than 11 years in prison, Ross Ulbricht walked free that same night. The reaction split the country in 2. To his supporters, it was justice, the long-overdue correction of a cruel sentence. To critics, including families who blamed the site for overdose deaths, it was a man who built a criminal empire walking away from the consequences. Both reactions were real, both were deeply felt. So what did Silk Road actually leave behind? In the short term, its fall didn't end the dark web drug trade, it multiplied it. Within months, copycat marketplaces appeared to fill the vacuum, and law enforcement found itself fighting not one Silk Road, but dozens. In the long term, the case became a permanent reference point in some of the most important debates of the digital age. How much anonymity should people be allowed online? How do you police a marketplace with no borders and no headquarters? When someone builds a tool that others use to do harm, how much of that harm belongs to the builder? Strip away the Bitcoin and the encryption, and Silk Road is really a story about an idea taken to its limit, the idea that freedom should have no boundaries at all, and the very human cost of finding out where those boundaries actually lie. Ross Ulbricht believed he was building a new kind of world. Instead, he built a case study that the internet is still arguing about today. At Shinwari Files, we follow the evidence, not the noise. If you want more deep dives like this one, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next case file.